Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last class, we talked about the progressive era policies of Teddy Roosevelt, but we mentioned that there were two other presidents of the progressive era, that of William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. And that takes us to episode 3, the progressivism of Taft and Wilson. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have 4 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to summarize American domestic and foreign policies during the Taft presidency. You should be able to discuss political disagreements between the Republican Party during the 1912 election. You should be able to characterize the progressive era reforms of the Wilson administration and compare Woodrow Wilson's ideal of moral imperialism with how it was actually carried out. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 7. When Teddy Roosevelt became president, he became president after McKinley's assassination. At age 42, the youngest president in American history. In 1904, he ran for president in his own right and won office. And when he won office in 1904, he promised that he wouldn't run again in 1908, but would instead turn over the hands of power to someone else. And so in 1908, he handpicked his Secretary of War, a guy named William Howard Taft, and essentially told the Republican Party, this is the guy you need to go nominate for president. The Republican Party did, elected Taft, and Taft in 1908 squared off against the Democratic nominee, William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, we met in our last unit as the leader of the progressive movement, leader of the populist movement, the free coinage of silver guy, the cross of gold speech, the model of the Wizard of Oz. He runs for president for the 3rd time. He'd run in 1894 and then in 1900, and then he runs again in 1908 against William Howard Taft. And Taft beats him there, 3-time presidential loser, William Jennings Bryan. But anyway, so Taft wins office, and he has a lot less bravado than Roosevelt did. He just doesn't have the same cachet that Teddy Roosevelt did. He only cautiously pursued the progressive agenda. Because he wasn't nearly as ostentatious as Roosevelt, Taft got little credit for his successes. He didn't use the presidential bully pulpit like his predecessor did to go arouse public opinion. But Taft aggressively pursued that antitrust policy, actually more aggressively than Roosevelt did, and broke up far more trusts than the trust buster, but just wasn't as good as the self-promotion as TR was. Subpoint B. Taft had campaigned on a policy of lowering tariffs, which was a pretty typical position of progressives at the time. The House of Representatives then took up his call and passed a bill known as the Payne Bill. The Payne Bill reorganized tariffs and basically lowered them in most areas. The Senate also passed a tariff reform bill known as the Aldrich Bill. It wasn't nearly as wide-sweeping, and actually in its reforms raised tariffs on a few issues. But of course, for a bill to become a law, it has to pass identically through both chambers. And the combined bill that resulted, the Payne-Aldrich Bill, actually raised tariffs a little bit in its reorganization and reform. Taft, however, signed the bill, even though it had moderately raised tariffs, saying that it was a good compromise, and it wasn't perfect, but it was good legislation nevertheless. But that compromise in the Payne-Aldrich Bill caused Taft to begin to lose progressive support. Meanwhile, Taft supported the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution, old Sweet 16, legalized the United States income tax, which caused him to lose support from non-progressives in the Republican Party as well. Now, except for a brief time during the Civil War and a short-lived attempt in 1890 to go collect a tax on corporate earnings, the United States didn't have a nationwide income tax. The federal government collected tax revenue by raising tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. Now, when goods are made in another country and brought into the United States, they were required to pay certain taxes for the right to go unload in American ports. Sellers then raise the money to go pay for those tariffs by raising the price on the goods that they're bringing into the country. In effect, it makes imported goods more expensive than similar goods produced in the United States. Because it makes imports more expensive, some people argue that tariffs help American businesses and it protect American jobs because it makes American goods appear cheaper than imported goods. Others argue, though, that it allows domestic producers to go raise their prices up to the market value, and it allows foreign competition to go sell their products at a higher price to go cover the cost of the tariffs, but it's an artificially higher price. They argue that tariffs then raise the cost of goods to all consumers, and anybody that buys stuff has to pay more across the board, and while it does help protect American jobs, it makes everybody pay higher prices, regardless of whether the stuff was made at home or abroad. Progressives also argued that the tariffs discriminated against the poor and the working class. Though all consumers, rich or poor, would have to pay higher prices for the things they purchased, poor people couldn't easily afford the higher prices. And so, they argued, while it might seem like a tariff causes other countries' imports to fund the federal government, what it effectively does is funds the federal government by hurting the poorest of American citizens. Instead, they said, you should have a federal income tax where people would pay different percentages of their income depending on how much they earned in a particular year. This graduated tax, progressives argued, was a fairer way to raise government revenue. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution created a federal income tax. It was proposed in 1909 during the Taft presidency and enacted in 1913 during Wilson's presidency. It was the third slowest amendment to be added to the Constitution at 1,302 days between proposal and ratification. Subpoint D. Here I want to talk about how Taft manages the question of conservation. While Teddy Roosevelt was one of the great conservative presidents, it's harder to say that about Taft. Conservationists became angry when Taft named Richard Bollinger to be the Secretary of the Interior. The Department of Interior manages national parks and public lands for the common good. It's a delightfully Washington, D.C. thing that the Department of Interior manages stuff that's outside, but that's what the interior, like interior of the country, I guess. Anyway, Bollinger then is named as the Secretary of Interior. And one of his first great acts is that he opens up public lands to private interests. When a Department of Interior official protested, saying, hey, it's the job of the Department of Interior to go conserve lands, not to mine it or cut it, Bollinger actually goes and fires that official. And then that official immediately turned around and went to the press and wrote a muckraking article for a magazine expose against Richard Bollinger. Congress then, having read the article, goes on and starts an investigation of the Department of Interior, and they called the head of the U.S. Forestry Service, a guy named Gifford Pinchot, to go testify in the investigation. Taft said, okay, wait a minute now. Gifford Pinchot is the head of the Forestry Department, which is in the Department of Interior, and he's testifying against Bollinger, who's leading the Department of Interior. Taft is like, I'm not sure what's going on in this department, but it looks like chaos down there. And so upset that someone in his administration was openly challenging the authority of a superior, Taft went and fired Pinchot. And so... School's letting out. That's the clock going off. Anyway, and so this, just all in all, this looks like Taft is mismanaging how conservation should be carried out in the country as well. Subpoint E. Now, the way that Taft is going to approach the rest of the world is different than his predecessor is. Even though he had been Secretary of War and a man who's comfortable with conflict, Taft doesn't want to go threaten muscle quite the way that Roosevelt would. He emphasized, in fact, economic investment and loans from American banks rather than threatening direct military intervention. In 1911, there was a rebellion that nearly bankrupted the country of Nicaragua. And so President Taft loaned Nicaragua money in order that they could go pay off their debts for putting down that rebellion. In return, United States bankers said that they got to take repayment of their loan, basically to take payment from the debt, by taking over Nicaragua's custom duties, or essentially managing their tariffs. Also, they took over the railroads and the national banks, the biggest industries in Nicaragua. Nicaraguan citizens looked at this and they said, wait a minute, our president just signed a deal with the American president that hands over our most important industries to go put down a rebellion against a guy we don't like anyway? The Nicaraguan citizens were outraged and tried to oust their president. The United States then responded by sending in 2,000 United States Marines to go support that government and prop it back up. This practice of guaranteeing loans to foreign countries was called dollar diplomacy by its critics, and it was often used in justifying keeping European powers out of the Caribbean altogether. Roman numeral number 8. Here I want to talk about kind of a split in the progressive movement and a split in the Republican Party. Subpoint A. Here we need to talk about what the leadership of the Republican Party was looking at. And essentially, the Republican Party was made up of two camps. On one side, you had the progressive wing, that's like the Teddy Roosevelt wing. And on the other side, you had the conservative wing, which is led by a guy named Joe Cannon. Uncle Joe Cannon was the House of Representatives Speaker. So he's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Essentially, he's the most important person in Congress. He was a rough-talking, good old boy, a power broker who essentially used the House of Representatives to advance his conservative agenda over the progressives. And he often disregarded the seniority rules of the House and weakened the progressive agenda, even among Republicans, members of his own party, ones that he just didn't like. And he often just outright ignored progressive-minded bills. And in March of 1910, the progressive wing of the Republican Party teamed up with the Democrats to go marginalize Joe Cannon. But by the midterm elections, the Republican Party ended up being so fractured that the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt's looking at all of this going on, and he says, wait a minute. I left in 1908 a Republican Party unified and a progressive agenda that was successful in the hands of Taft. And 4 years later, it's a mess. The Republican Party is fractured. The progressive movement looks like it's in shambles. And he believed that the Republican Party was hungry for the old bravado leadership of Teddy Roosevelt to come step in and save the day. I've long thought that this is actually where Teddy Roosevelt really saw himself most valuable, as kind of almost like a messiah sort of figure on political issues. And so Teddy Roosevelt returned basically saying, hey, Teddy Roosevelt's back. The Republican Party should nominate me for president, and I'll come in and save the day and right the ship. However, Taft had been in power now for 4 years and had enough positions in the Republican Party that when Roosevelt shows up to the convention and begs for the nomination, the Republican Party doesn't side with Roosevelt. They stay hitched to Taft and they don't nominate him. Roosevelt, though, figured that he had a good enough electoral chance and enough political credit that he could go and spin off a third party, a progressive party, colloquially known as the Bull Moose Party. Promising more voter participation in government, he was a champion of women's suffrage and labor legislation and business controls. And that takes us to subpoint B, the 1912 election. The 1912 election was a four-way race between the Republican incumbent, William Howard Taft, the Bull Moose progressive of Teddy Roosevelt, the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson was a reform-minded governor of New Jersey and also a fourth-party candidate, Eugene V. Debs of the Socialist Party. And it became a national debate on the relationship between the political and economic reform, freedom, and the age of big business. Woodrow Wilson argued a progressive era platform known as the New Freedoms, which was like stronger antitrust laws and banking reform and lower tariffs. Wilson called all monopolies evil and basically said you needed to break them all up. Roosevelt wanted oversight of big business, but he insisted that all monopolies weren't evil and sometimes they could work in the public interest. The socialist candidate, Eugene V. Debs, he wanted to end capitalism, an unsurprising position for a socialist. Socialism was influential in the debate, but wasn't really significant in the voting. The Republican Party was divided between the Taft side and the Roosevelt side. If you were a progressive then, you were divided between the Roosevelt progressives or the Wilson progressives, but the Democrats were entirely united behind Wilson. And so with a split Republican Party and a unified Democratic Party, Wilson easily won an electoral victory and was joined by a Democratic majority in Congress. And that takes us to Roman numeral number 9, Wilsonianism. Subpoint A, what does Wilson's style of progressivism look like? Well, Wilson was a lawyer and a professor and a president of Princeton and then even the governor of New Jersey. He grew up as a Southerner during the Civil War and during Reconstruction. He was a son of 3 generations of Presbyterian ministers, and he was a strict product of a strict upbringing in a troubled era. Wilson proved himself to be a strong executive leader, and in his first term of president, he focused on trusts, tariffs, and high finance. By his second term, we consider him less of his progressive chops and more of his World War I chops, but We'll get there when we get there. With Democrats in control of Congress, Wilson aggressively moved to implement his model of progressivism. He insisted that democracy needed to be reinvigorated by restoring market competition and freeing the government from domination of big businesses. He urges the passage of the Underwood Tariff Act, which would reduce tariffs and impose a graduated income tax on the richest 5% of Americans. And it successfully reduced tariffs by the biggest measure since the Civil War. Also, he argues for the Clayton Antitrust Act, which stopped companies from buying stock to go form a monopoly. It also ended injunctions against strikers. Unless the strikers caused some irreparable damage to the economy, they basically said the federal government wouldn't get involved in a labor strike, an act that Samuel Gompers, leader of the AFL, called the Magna Carta of labor. Subpoint B. Wilson also set the precedent of giving the State of the Union address as a speech in person to Congress. This Constitution required the president to update the Congress on the State of the Union from time to time, but didn't say how frequently it needed to be done or how it would be carried out. Thomas Jefferson gave a State of the Union address as a letter to Congress. Jefferson just hated speeches and would rather write it down. But Wilson changed that tradition to giving speeches, calling both houses of Congress together so Wilson can lecture them, and to do it much more frequently, in fact, on a yearly basis if he could. Wilson then used the opportunity to call both houses of Congress together and to plead for them to introduce new tax reform. He used his version of the bully pulpit to go get those bills passed. Wilson also abandoned the idea of trust busting in effort of favor greater supervision of the economy, saying he wasn't going to break up trust anymore as much as just micromanage their economic activity. He also established the Federal Reserve System, a private banking system under federal control. He divided the country into 12 different districts with a central bank in each district of them. We have one in my favorite city of Kansas City. The Federal Reserve System formed the basis of today's modern banking system. Wilson also started the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, as a new watchdog agency to investigate regulatory violations and to end unfair business practices. Roman numeral number 10, let's talk about how Wilson approaches the rest of the world. Wilson repudiated the Taftian approach of dollar diplomacy. He promised a new foreign policy that would respect Latin America's independence. Wilson believed that the export of American manufactured goods and investments went hand in hand with the spread of democracy, and pledged that he wouldn't go and unnecessarily get involved in Latin American affairs. But of course, politicians' promises only go so far, and that leads us to subpoint B of the Mexican Revolution. Mexico had been ruled by a dictator named Porfirio Diaz. Diaz enjoyed a good relationship with the United States and encouraged U.S. investment in Mexico. And it resulted in Americans owning a lot of Mexican resources like oil wells and mines and railroads and ranches. It made a few landowners super rich, but it made most people helplessly poor. And in 1911, a group of peasants and workers led by Francisco Madero overthrew Porfirio Diaz. Madero had promised these democratic reforms, but in a way that just like he promised everybody reform, he had a hard time satisfying the competing interests of landowners and peasants and factory workers and the middle class. And essentially, after 2 years of failed government, Madero was murdered by Victoriano Huerta. General Huerta then took over the government. Wilson looked at this act, the assassination by Huerta, and he refused to acknowledge Huerta as the new rightful ruler of Mexico. He says, that's not a government, that's a government of butchers. And he refused to, deal anything with Mexico during the time. And he patiently waited for Huerta to go entangle itself in American affairs. Subpoint C. And then Huerta's government entangles itself in American affairs. In 1914, Huerta's police arrested a small group of United States sailors in Tampico, a small port in Mexico. They were quickly released and apologies sent saying like, oh, I'm sorry, we didn't mean to arrest your American sailors. But it was basically a reason that Wilson was waiting for to go send in the United States Marines to occupy a bigger and more important port, the city of Veracruz. Mexicans basically greeted the Marines as invaders along the way rather than liberators, and they fought back against the United States Marines. In the skirmish, 18 Americans and 200 Mexicans were killed killed in the fighting. The United States and Mexico nearly erupted into full-on war, but Argentina and Brazil and Chile stopped in to mediate and avoid the war altogether. South American countries suggested that, hey, how about Huerta just resign and the United States should withdraw without paying any of the damages. Huerta refused to do so. Wilson refused to acknowledge Huerta's legitimacy, and they were in a standoff. The standoff, though, was short-lived. Huerta's regime collapsed on its own a few months later, and a new nationalist government was set up into place. Wilson withdrew their troops and then recognized that new government is the rightful government of Mexico. And that takes us to subpoint D. Francisco Pancho Villa, we know him as Pancho Villa, and Emiliano Zapata opposed the new nationalist government, saying, well, this new government actually doesn't speak for the interests of the poor. Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa wanted real land reform, and they were ready to go fight this new government. They said, it's better to die on your feet than to live on your knees, and Zapata told peasants to join him. Though Pancho Villa tried to court U.S. favor, Woodrow Wilson recognized that new nationalist government instead, so Villa then threatened to attack the United States. When American miners were en route to operate American-owned mines in Mexico, Pancho Villa's men ripped the Americans off their train and shot them execution style. Then Pancho Villa's men raided Columbus, New Mexico, and in the raid killed 17 Americans. This causes Wilson to go send in Brigadier General John J. Pershing to lead a force of 15,000 soldiers into Mexico to go capture Pancho Villa, dead or alive. For nearly a year, they looked the Mexican countryside in northern Mexico, searching for him and searching in vain. Then Woodrow Wilson added 150,000 National Guardsmen along the U.S.-Mexican border, and meanwhile, Mexicans grew angry about having United States military presence in their country, breaking into battles with the nationalist government, and Mexico demanded the United States withdraw altogether, but America withdrew unless they handed over Pancho Villa, which they refused to do so as well, and it nearly erupted again into full-on war between the United States and Mexico. Subpoint E. Both sides stepped back from this conflict as the Great War, it was World War I, began waging through Europe, and the United States realized that we might get dragged into an attack in Europe and thought that maybe it would be more prudent to have peace at home. So Wilson ordered Pershing to come back to the United States. Soon after, Mexico drew up a new constitution that stripped American control of oil and mineral resources, and it restricted foreign investors from owning Mexican resources. Mexico eventually put down its own civil war and made steps towards reform. Though Wilson had promised a policy that respected Latin American independence, Wilson's idea of moral imperialism produced more military interventions in Latin America than any president had before or since. And it's a classic Wilson move to promise one thing and carry out another. But how Wilson's going to go approach the rest of the world, not just in Mexico, but abroad, is a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.